Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for tuning in. Happy Friday. My name is Audrey Stewart. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so pleased to welcome you to tonight's event with Perri Klass discussing her new book, A Good Time to Be Born, How Science and Public Health Gave Children a Future. She is joined tonight in conversation by Maria Tatar. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our new digital community during these challenging times. Our spring season is our biggest virtual season yet, so make sure to check out our event schedule at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for questions. If you have a question at any time during the talk tonight, go to the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. If you would like to purchase a copy of A Good Time to Be Born, there will be a link in the chat where you can purchase. All sales through this link support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you, especially during this difficult time for community spaces like your local bookstore. There will also be a link for donation in the chat if you would like to give additional support to Harvard Bookstore. Your purchases and financial contributions make this virtual author series possible and now more than ever supports the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you for tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings these last many months, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as we can. Thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. Now I am so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers, who were both two very busy women. Perri Klass is a professor of journalism and pediatrics at New York University, co-director of NYU Florence, and the national medical director of Reach Out and Read. She attended Harvard Medical School and completed her residency in pediatrics at Boston's Children's Hospital. She writes the weekly column, The Checkup, for the New York Times, and her medical journalism has appeared in a wide variety of publications, including the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New Yorker, the New England Journal of Medicine, and Harvard Medicine. She is the author of 11 books. She is joined tonight by Maria Tatar. Maria is the author of Enchanted Hunters, the editor and translator of annotated editions of works by Hans Christian Andersen and by the Brothers Grimm, and the editor of an annotated edition of J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan. She is the John L. Loeb Research Professor of Folklore and Mythology and Germanic Languages and Literature at Harvard University, as well as a Senior Fellow of Harvard Society of Fellows. Tonight, they're discussing Perri's latest book, A Good Time to Be Born. Nothing has affected the history of families more than the untimely death of a child. Interweaving her own experiences as a medical student and doctor, Perri Klass pays tribute to the groundbreaking women in pediatrics, public health, nurses, and scientists who brought new approaches and scientific ideas about sanitation and vaccination to families. And I want to leave you with a note of praise from one of my favorite writers, David Oshinsky. Elegantly written, filled with memorable characters and events, A Good Time to Be Born is the perfect prescription for the uncertainties of our time. And on that note of praise, I'll turn things over to our authors. Perri, Maria, thank you so much for being here. The virtual podium is yours.
Thank you, Audrey, and it's wonderful to be here. And I want to thank my favorite bookstore for sponsoring this event. And Perri, congratulations to you on this colossal achievement, this extraordinary volume. We know you as a storyteller. You have been a great storyteller, and now we see you as a historian in action. We see all of your talents on display in this book. There's a kind of encyclopedic inclusiveness to it. That is, you cover so much material. And I know that encyclopedic is an insult to some people, but I love the fact that there's so much rich information there. And yet the book is also a page turner. It has stories. It has wonderful stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. on the edge of my bed, I guess, because I was reading it several nights during the past month. I have a million questions for you. And before I bombard you with them, I wanted to ask first about this book, because as I was reading it, I thought, and I know this is a little bit of a cliche, Perri has been writing this book all her life. I've known you for a long time, since you were at medical school, and I've gotten glimmers and glimpses of this book. So can you tell us about how it took shape, what motivated it, and sort of why you wrote this volume?
I would love to. First, let me say thank you to you, Maria, for doing this with you. Thank you to Audrey. And again, what a coincidence, we're in my favorite bookstore too, the bookstore of my heart. So thrilled to be here. I think you're right. I think I've been in some ways certainly writing this book ever since my own medical training at Children's Hospital in Boston in the 1980s. And when I trained as a pediatrician in that amazing institution, one of the things that I learned, that we all learned, was that children were not supposed to die. That was our job. That was why we were in pediatrics. When children did die, it was either because there was something that in pediatrics we hadn't learned to do yet. They could, and it wasn't that we could individually fix everything, but people could fix most of the congenital cardiac problems, but maybe there were some that were so severe that they couldn't fix them yet. There were things that couldn't be treated, but they would be someday. And either that, or there had been some lapse, some failure of safety, some failure to protect a child. But we went into pediatrics for the most part with the idea that all of the children we took care of should outgrow us. They should live to grow up. They should go on to be the patients of people who took care of adults, even with all of their problems. And that was one of the things that drew you into pediatrics. And even when you were on the pediatric oncology ward, they greeted you proudly by telling you that 90% or more of the children who came through pediatric oncology would survive. And it was thinking about what a change that was, just from my grandmother. So I was training in the 1980s. My grandmothers in the early 20th century, in the 1920s, when they were having their children, my parents, in Brooklyn, in New York, that wasn't the case, that you could just make the assumption that children were not supposed to die unless something unusual or something tragic went wrong. If you were thinking about my grandmother's era, that not so long ago time at the beginning of our own 20th century, if you went around a table, pretty much everyone would have lost a child, lost a sibling, lost friends in school. It was a much more predictable, expected, though still tragic, part of being a parent. And I think I started thinking then, and have been thinking more and more ever since, both about what changed and also about how that change affected us all, affected us as pediatricians, affected us as parents, but affected us as a society. It's a really huge change. And it's a change that separates us, where we are now, where we were even in the 1980s, from all the parents all through history who had to live with the knowledge that many children you just had to expect would not make it.
Tell us about some of the diseases that struck terror in the hearts of our ancestors and that still scare us today. You're speaking to somebody who was born with the measles. So tell us about diphtheria, tuberculosis, throw in a little scarlet fever. What about these diseases? And I know there are many pediatricians out there, but I think it would be great just to get your fix on some of these, or maybe just one.
Well, one of the things that I kept thinking about, both as a parent and also as a pediatrician, was what did it mean to be a parent in the era when, mommy, my throat hurts, meant possibly, it had to cross your mind at least, you know, scarlet fever, diphtheria, meant diseases which couldn't be treated and which were at least some of the time very, very serious. And I wondered about what that meant for families, for parents. And I also wondered about what that meant for the doctors who were called in. And so I can talk to you a little bit about diphtheria. So diphtheria is a disease that I have never seen. When I was training in the 80s, we were all vaccinated against measles, and we didn't see a lot of measles. In fact, there's been more measles around more recently because of so many children going unvaccinated. But when I was training, we didn't see a lot of measles. When a kid came in with a really exciting rash and it crossed your mind as a trainee, could this be measles? You looked at the picture in the book, and then you went and found one of the older supervising attending physicians. And you said, we were wondering, could this possibly be measles? And as you yourself said, Maria, the attending would walk in, look at the child, and invariably would turn to us and say, you know, your grandmother could make this diagnosis. Quite possibly your grandmother could make this diagnosis from across the room. And so measles was, we knew it was still out there, and our teachers had seen it. And some of our teachers had seen polio, but pretty much no one had ever seen diphtheria. We had all learned it out of books. So here you have a bacterial disease. It's a respiratory infection, and children are very vulnerable to respiratory infections because their airways are small. It's a bacteria which creates a toxin, a poison, which attacks various cells in the body. And you basically, you can get a sort of a, it's called a pseudomembrane, a mass of dead tissue in the throat, which can actually suffocate the child. And it was a very scary disease. There were terrible diphtheria epidemics, left a lot of children dead in colonial America. And it was a disease which moved through without people having any way to prevent it or to treat it. Rich, poor, I'll give you some examples later on of some of the children of the rich and powerful. And it was a terrifying disease because you couldn't prevent it and you couldn't treat it. And there were diphtheria wards in every important children's hospital in the 19th century, and it's gone. Everything I know about it, I know from reading, and you start thinking about these chunks. It's not gone everywhere in the world, but it's gone here. You start thinking about these sort of categories of human suffering that are just gone, that people lived with and worried about and thought about. I talk in the book about the person who's usually described as the founding father of American pediatrics, Dr. Abraham Jacobi, who writes he writes a treatise on diphtheria. He knows probably more about diphtheria than anywhere in the world, but he writes about the fact that he does tracheotomies. He actually cuts open the airway of child after child, and it doesn't help. They die anyway. And he sort of writes that it's because it's the impossibility of watching a child suffocate. You have to do something, even though his own numbers tell him it's probably not going to help. And then tragically, his own son dies of diphtheria because, again, all of the information and all of the clinical experience can't actually solve that problem then. So there's an example. And then scarlet fever, the other disease you mentioned, which is caused by group A strep, the same organism that causes strep throat. We do sometimes see scarlet fever with its characteristic, sandpapery red rash. But one of the stories I tell in the book is the story of, as a pediatrician, proudly making the diagnosis. Oh yes, you have scarlet fever, and even coming up with the Spanish word to explain to the child's grandmother what the diagnosis was. And the grandmother, who was from another country, began to cry because that was a terrifying name still to her. And that is now a disease which we pretty routinely would just treat with antibiotics and would not think of as terrifying.
There are so many tragic stories in your narrative. I mean, the book has, by the end, of course, there's a kind of uplift. Thank goodness we've gotten through that. But tell me about some of the coping strategies that parents use to get through this. the loss of a child, something that is really unimaginable to us. What sorts of strategies did people use? Can you say something about the culture, say, of the 19th century? And, you know, you write about the cult of the dead child, for example. Tell us more.
And you should tell us a little about it too, because I'm sure you know a great deal, but we all know. So first of all, let me just say that I actually think this is a very happy story. It's a positive story. It's a story, I would say it's a story of probably the greatest thing we've ever done as a species, this collective endeavor. It's not one single project. It's putting together basic science and public health and medicine and nursing and parent advocacy and education and sanitation. It's putting all of these endeavors and expertises together so that you get to a point where the world becomes safer and you get so many more happy endings and you lose this suffering. But one of the things that was interesting was this question of parents who are living in an era when they know that this may happen. Do we still identify with the way that they write about their emotions, the way that they write about their connection to their children, the way that they write when their children actually do get sick and die? And the answer is yes. You recognize every emotion, you feel with them. The 19th century, as we know, and there's generally kind of a cult of mourning. There's, you know, an etiquette of what you wear when you're in mourning. There's a certain amount of, there's mourning jewelry. There's a kind of
the pictures of the children who look as if they're asleep, but in fact, they're taken post-mortem.
Yes, there are post-mortem photographs and sometimes paintings, and not just of children, that's done with adults as well. And so there's a certain amount of, there's religious consolation. And I think one of the really interesting tensions that you see is what that means is if you are truly religious, Christian, and you are expected to accept this as God's will, and you continue to grieve as a parent, at a certain point, it may be felt that you're being blasphemous, that you are refusing to accept God's will. And so there's also a certain amount of guilt that comes into play there. Obviously, if there's comfort, that's a wonderful thing. But there's also a certain responsibility to, there's a narrative arc you're supposed to follow in which you are able to rejoice that the child has gone home to God, that the child has been spared the sins and the sufferings of this world. And that's wrapped up. I don't know if you want to say anything about that from the point of view of, you know, thinking about the cult of the dead child.
I think about Janeway's Token for Children, in which you have, I think, about 40 different beautiful deaths. Children who are on their deathbed are reciting scripture and ready to go to heaven. And I think in some ways that book was a comfort, not just for parents, but for children, for other children who experience the death of siblings and friends. And so this was a common experience. It wasn't extraordinary the way it is today. So tell us, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say children also had to live with that awareness and with that certainty. And in fact, one of the scenes I write about, probably the most famous death in a 19th century children's book, which is in Little Women, the scene ends with the suffering has been relieved. And I think the line is that the family thanks God that Beth is well at last, because, you know, suffering is over, and there's a sort of, and clearly there's great comfort in that for many people. But I think what's interesting is what do you do if your soul rebels at this, if you cannot bring yourself to be grateful?
Yes.
Sorry, what were you going to ask?
Well, I was, I want to get back to what you said about a collective effort, these kinds of powerful collaborations at a time when it was not so easy to communicate with other people, with those who were in other countries or other regions. So it was a collective effort, and yet one of the great things about your book is that you tell us about the heroes and the heroines. There's a gender story there too, because of course you have midwives and nurses and doctors who are mainly male. But tell us about, you told us about one of the heroes, maybe a heroine, Josephine Baker, and the wonderful delivery of a baby.
Oh, yes. Well, I love, I mean, some of this is that I do think that with the entrance of more women into medicine, into nursing, into public health nursing, you do see a little bit, you see a reorientation toward the health of the well child, the normal child, toward a respect for preventive public health. And I do try to talk about that, but I also have to acknowledge that when I came up against the voice of a woman speaking from the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, telling the story of training and practicing in the job that I knew, I identified. And I found those figures really interesting. So Josephine Baker, Sarah Josephine Baker, she's got the same name as the glamorous singer-dancer Josephine Baker. And she's all through her life, she's very amused whenever anybody meets her expecting that glamour and finds instead, the respectable director of the Children's Bureau of Hygiene in New York City. But she tells this amazing story. It takes place in Boston. She's trained as a doctor. She started working in 1898 as a young novice doctor in poor neighborhoods in Boston, and she's summoned to help a woman in labor. And she writes in her memoir that the room is filthy, and the patient is on a heap of straw, and there are 4 stunted children too frightened to make any noise, and her back is a sore. She says that her husband has burned her by throwing a kettle of hot water on her. And at that point, she says, the husband, who had been lying drunk on the floor, rose to his feet in anger and began to threaten both women, his pregnant wife and the young doctor. And Josephine Baker runs out into the corridor. The husband follows. He's waving his fist. He's cursing. And then she writes, as he lurched after me, he crossed the stairhead, and with instinctive reaction, I doubled my fist and hit him. Beautifully timed. I weighed hardly half as much as he, but he was practically incapable of standing up, and this frantic tap of mine was strategically placed. Stuck about a third of the way down the rather long stair and slid to the bottom with a hideous crash. Then there was absolute silence. I had taken my opportunity, and the result was evident. I went back into the room, pushed a piece of furniture against the closed door, and delivered the baby undisturbed. And then she gets worried that maybe she's killed him and maybe her medical career is about to end. But she says she only worried about that when the delivery was finished, the room partly cleaned up, the children cared for, and the patient made comfortable. And she says it had been sheer reflex instinct. He was in the way and not fit to live anyhow, and I had taken the first handy means of getting rid of him. I was not sorry. I was not glad either. It had just been part of the exigencies of this particular job. Well, I thought as calmly as I could, there is an end of your medical career and probably jail to follow. But he was alive and cursing at her as she went down the stairs.
Extraordinary. I think isn't the title of her autobiography Fighting for Life?
Fighting for Life, and it's about bringing public health to the city of New York, to the tenements, to the instituting school nurses, finding ways to prevent illness. And she writes about this sort of amazing idea that the way to save babies is actually to prevent disease before it happens, to help mothers learn how to prepare clean milk, to have families get clean milk, to encourage breastfeeding, to give parents the tools that they need to keep their children safe. And that's very important because when this is happening, she doesn't have antibiotics. She doesn't have therapy, any sense of fluid therapy for diarrhea. She's not got a whole lot of therapeutics. They're doing this and they bring down that infant mortality rate, especially in the tenements. They do it on public health, sanitation, and education and support for the families, even though the families are bringing up their children in very difficult conditions.
And I remember what she said about hygiene. Those words, we could have done something about it, but we did nothing. I mean, she was really on the front lines doing these things. And, you know, eventually her example was followed, but she was alone, I think, for a while as a resistance fighter.
Well, the New York City Department of Public Health there at the beginning of the 20th century takes steps which are, it's the first city in the country to form that Bureau of Child Hygiene. They're sort of on top of the new discoveries with diphtheria, and they're on the school nurses. They're not the only people thinking about settlement houses and public health efforts. There's a lot that goes on in Chicago. There's a lot that goes on in Boston and Philadelphia. But these are the people who are thinking about, there's a book published in 1906 in England called Infant Mortality, A Social Problem, in which a doctor who's been counting infant mortality all over the country, all over Great Britain, makes the claim that the children who are dying, it's a social problem, he says. We are failing families. It's not a family by family, illness by illness, dereliction of duty issue. It's that we as a society are not creating the circumstances in which children can be born, parents can take care of them and keep them healthy. And what's interesting about that is it's a pretty new idea in 1906.
Yeah.
That you can actually do something about this tremendous loss of life, first in the first month of life, then in the first year of life, and then in the first 5 to 10 years of life, building on that. It's all of the societies for the prevention of infant mortality including in the United States, they're formed in that first decade of the 20th century, or the very end of the 19th. So even though we know that all through history, you've been losing as many as 2, 3, 4 out of every 10 live-born children, it's not a cause. There's not an organization yet already formed before that to keep those children alive. It's kind of a new idea.
That's so fascinating. And before we turn to questions from the audience, I want to ask about that. I want to just take up that last point. You know, people often ask, what is the takeaway from your book? And I hate that because your book is so rich and so fascinating, and there's so many different aspects to this problem. But I would say, you know, what messages in the plural are we sending? That is, what is it about what you have written that helps us get through our own public health crisis today? Can you say a few words about that? And then sure. I think we'll have a quick little PowerPoint, because there's so many rich images, pretty beautiful, well, I should not say, moving, stirring images in this book. And I want to give you a chance to show those before we go to audience questions. But
I do have a takeaway. And I'll the first one I've already referenced, which is that this is not one mission. This is not, you know, heroic medical science. This is bench science of various kinds. This is public health. This is parent advocacy. This is nursing and public health nursing. This is sanitation. This is the first piece is about all the different kinds of expertise that you actually need to bring to bear on a problem this complicated. But second thing is, and I think it's really relevant for this moment, making the world safe for children is not about drawing a boundary around your home and saying, in my home, we have everything that we can do. You make this progress by making the community safe, making the city safe, making the country safe, making the world safe. That doesn't mean that it all happens equitably. That doesn't mean that it even has achieved that yet. But all of the success is based on kind of an understanding that we're all in this together, and that you make the world safe for your child by making the community, the world safer for all children. And I think that's actually a message which almost everyone, the people who I'm sort of writing about as heroes and heroines, would probably agree with.
Such true words, and the book is true in so many different ways. And it would be great if you could just, I'm going to turn to the questions from the audience. While I do that, while I take a look, maybe you could show us.
Yeah. I'm going to show you, can you see this now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so this is going to be a really fast PowerPoint, but this is a graph from the CDC. Infant mortality rate, that's the number of children out of every 1,000 live births who don't make it to their first birthday across the 20th century in the United States. I think it's a graph that speaks for itself. It starts in 1915 because that's when they start counting. Before that, there's not that same systematic counting. And you'll see that in 1915, you're still, by the first birthday, this has nothing to do with how many 2-year-olds die of diarrhea or how many 4-year-olds die of scarlet fever or how many 6-year-olds die of diphtheria. By the first birthday, you are still losing more than 100 out of every 1,000 newborns. And I think the graph of what happens first over the first half of the century and then continuing up through 1995 kind of speaks for itself about the story that I'm trying to tell. I mentioned Dr. Jacobi, who wrote the treatise on diphtheria. This is a photograph of Ernst Jacobi, who was the son of Abraham Jacobi and his wife, a remarkable doctor, Mary Putnam Jacobi, actually connected to the publishing Putnam family. But the amount of expertise in that family about children's health, women's health, in 1883, 3 years after Dr. Jacobi published his treatise, Ernst and his sister both got diphtheria. She recovered. He died on June 10th. His father wrote, aged 7 years, 10 months, and 7 days. The expertise did, and you can imagine as a pediatrician reading this, how you identify and think about what that meant to not be able to help. So I promised you some children of famous and powerful people. I'm going to give you a couple of presidential children. This is baby Ruth Cleveland, who was born between her father's 2 presidential terms. She was a very famous child known as baby Ruth because she was a White House child. She was born between the 2 terms, and he went back into Grover Cleveland went back into the White House, and she was baby Ruth in the White House. But then in 1904, after he left office, she came down with diphtheria. There was a treatment, but it didn't work. She died 5 days later. And as a piece of trivia, the Baby Ruth candy bar, they claimed they had named for her, although probably they were just saying that to avoid paying royalty to Babe Ruth. Here's another presidential child 20 years later in 1924. It's Calvin Coolidge Jr. And the story about Calvin Coolidge Jr. is that his father had him do agricultural work because he was supposed to, not be a spoiled kid. And somebody says to him, if my father was president, I wouldn't be doing this job, picking tobacco. And he says, well, if your father were my father, you would be. And then when he's 16 and his father's in the White House and Calvin Jr. is playing lawn tennis on the White House grounds, he develops a blister on his toe. He gets bacterial sepsis. It's Staph aureus, we know. And he's taken to Walter Reed and he's surrounded, by all of the most important doctors that anyone can call. And there's nothing they can do in 1924. He dies, and Calvin Coolidge writes later, when he went, the power and the glory of the presidency went with him. And then finally, 20 years further, 1904, 1924, this is 1963, the only baby born to a sitting president in the 20th century is Patrick Bouvier Kennedy. Jackie Kennedy is vacationing on Cape Cod. She goes into labor 5.5 weeks early. So 5.5 weeks before the 40 weeks, which would be full term, she goes into labor. The baby's born by cesarean section on the Air Force Base and is rushed to Children's Hospital in Boston because he's 5.5 weeks early and he's having trouble breathing. And I'm just showing you how this plays out in the headlines. And in Boston, he's given the most high-tech modern treatment, which is bariatric oxygen, hyperbaric oxygen therapy, and he dies 2 days later because even though by our current standards, and they used to talk about him when I was training 20 years after that, when we were routinely resuscitating babies who were born at 28, 29 weeks gestation, babies who weighed less than 1.5 pounds, they would talk about the fact that in 1963, there was nothing you could do, even for the son of the president, if you needed to ventilate him. There's a picture of Josephine Baker looking like she knows what she's doing and recalling later those summer diarrhea epidemics that she battled. There are the visiting nurses at the Henry Street settlement who knocked on doors and went into houses and worked with parents to make sure they knew how to keep their babies safe. They were really the front lines. This is the Lincoln School for Nurses, founded in 1898 in New York in the Bronx, because many nursing schools would not admit African-American students, and these nurses go on to play unbelievably impressive roles in many American cities, in New York, in Philadelphia, especially in the Black community, working for public health. Here's the Pure Milk Depot in New York at the Presbyterian Church, where clean pasteurized milk is being made available to mothers and young children. It's a philanthropic endeavor. And eventually pasteurization will become the law, but it certainly isn't when this is happening. And there's one of those nurses, Elizabeth Tyler in Philadelphia, at the Little Mothers Club. This is a Josephine Baker innovation for children who are left in charge of their younger siblings, to have Little Mothers Clubs where they learn how to take care of babies, as you can see, using a doll. Finally, we talked about diphtheria and Ernst Jacobi. I want to remind you of probably the most famous story of the conquest of diphtheria, when they make an antitoxin. It's the first great triumph of bacteriology. You've got a weapon, you've got something which can defeat this terrible infection, and the epidemic breaks out in Nome in the winter, and the port is closed because it's iced in. The children start dying. They get the antitoxin from Anchorage to Nenana. And then for the last 674 miles, and again, this is playing out in the headlines, the heroic teams of sled dogs carry it across the trail. And so there's the statue of Balto in Central Park, which is probably the best known, best loved relic of this story. Although there are people who feel that Togo, who was the lead dog on the longest and most difficult part, who you see on the right, needs to get more credit. But you've got both Balto and Togo here. And then finally, after the anti-serum comes the vaccine. You don't need to treat it because you can prevent it. And here you are in the 1920s with the school children in New York lining up to get vaccinated in the school by the school nurse, because this is a mindset of meeting families where they are. And then I'm just going to close by showing you again what that infant mortality rate looks like across the 20th century, and why I say to you that this is actually a good story and a story we can be proud of, even with everything that is not perfect.
Yeah. Great. Well, we have some questions, and I wanted to start with Martha Wilson, who has read some of your novels and is curious about your writing. Perri, can you speak a bit about how doing this sort of writing feels different from your fiction writing, which is also often about medical issues?
So this was not a kind of writing that I've done a great deal of. I've now done a fair amount of nonfiction that's journalism, interviewing people, verifying facts that way. But this kind of writing, trying to pull together different historical pieces, was a new challenge. And one of the things about this book is that every subject that I wrote about, I kept thinking, there's somebody out there who's a real expert on this. There's some, you know, and I would know who they are, and I list all those books in the back. There's somebody out there who really understands the technology of the incubator and how it changed medicine. And his name is Jeffrey Baker, and he wrote a wonderful book called The Machine in the Nursery. There's a professor at Harvard, Evelyn Hammonds, who wrote an amazing book about diphtheria. And I would sort of sit here thinking, each of these subjects, there's so much to know. How do you ever get it down to one chapter? How, for every one of the people you include who's heroic, there are these people who you just are really sorry to leave by the wayside. But there is this kind of, again, I think, this remarkable narrative when you look at those graphs and you think about the total substance of how being a pediatrician, being a parent, being a child is different now. There's a story that you want to try to put together because it's such a recent change, and it's almost, and if we're not careful, we all forget it. When you read, and I'm going off on a tangent again, but anyway, so I mean, as somebody who writes both fiction and nonfiction, I've actually taught a course in the journalism department at NYU on fiction writing for journalists. And we joke about, you know, is this a good thing? But one of the things we do in that course is, as an exercise, we make things up. And I sort of say to the journalism students, it feels very, let's change the ending. Let's invent the great quote so that know what it feels like, and we never make a mistake, and we never come anywhere near doing it as journalists. It has it's different mental muscles.
Yes, it's so fascinating. And I think, you know, you talked about all of the different sources. I mean, the number of sources that you used is quite extraordinary. And somehow you've been able to synthesize all of that and put it into a story. But let's get to our next question from Flori Siri. Can you talk about the inequities of healthcare for children in non-white communities? Has it improved over the years? If not, what do we need to do to improve it? And I'm going to piggyback on that on another, our first question, which was, can you talk about the racial aspect of pediatrics through history? Do you want to address some aspects?
So let me start with what I talk about most in the book, which is that, so the overall trajectory, you were looking at infant mortality rates from the beginning of the century of over 100 children out of every 1,000 live births dying by the age of 1. The infant mortality rate, counting exactly the same way in the United States today, is between 6 and 7. So between 6 and 7 out of every 1,000 live births, the children don't make it to the first birthday. But the next story that you've got to say when you say that is, it's not the same rate in every community. It's more than double among African-American children. It's higher among Indigenous children. It's higher among Hispanic children. And the rate is actually also varies considerably geographically. So the first thing to say here is, if you go back a century and you look again at the rates, Black children versus white children, what you see is those inequities were there in the 19th century when the numbers were so much higher, when hundreds of children out of every 1,000 were dying. The Black children were dying at twice the rate, when that meant 300 or more out of every 1,000. So the rates come down, and they come down very dramatically, and an enormous number of babies are being saved in all of these communities, but the inequities persist. And the inequities persist in maternal mortality rate, and it's something which I think is getting and deserves a great deal of attention right now. And we can talk a little bit about what some of the underlying factors are in terms of access to healthcare, in terms of other systemic racism issues. But we also need to understand that one of the things we're seeing nowadays, I said that our infant mortality rate now is between 6 and 7 out of every 1,000 live births. If you look carefully at that, what you see is that almost all of those deaths are either related to prematurity or to other factors involved in pregnancy and childbirth. So what we're talking about here in large part is not just the health care being provided to the babies, but the care being provided to the mothers, the care being provided in pregnancy, but also before pregnancy. So that's why, it's a huge and complicated issue, but it would be wrong to define it too narrowly as what's happening to the babies. An awful lot of it is about the care, the access to care, and the life course of the mothers.
Yeah, and your book title really says it all. That is, it's the subtitle, that is Science and Public Health. That is, they have to work in tandem in order to produce change. Let me go to another question. Let's see, when you started writing this book, could you have imagined the pandemic we're encountering now? Did it change the course of the book in any way? And that's Don Goldman asking that question.
Well, of course, I couldn't have imagined the pandemic. I was as taken by surprise as many of us were, I think. But what I did think about a lot, and it affected the book in the sense that I kept thinking as I was finishing it and as the pandemic was happening, being reminded of the power of the microbes that live around us, live on us, that we're being reminded that whatever your society, whatever your setup, microbes will take advantage. They'll take advantage of the ways that you travel. They'll take advantage of the ways that you prepare food. That's the way we live among microbes. That's the way they live on us. And we're all being reminded with, tremendous fierceness and harshness right now of the ways that can affect every aspect of our lives. And I hope that in that setting to say, well, we've done some pretty clever things. We've conquered some pretty complicated, baked in problems. We haven't solved everything. We haven't fixed the inequities, but we've made a lot of progress. That should be a positive message for us now at a time when, for many people, I think probably the microbial world was not as scary as it now seems.
So here's a question. You have to get out your crystal ball for this one. Let's see, it's Jody Wenger who wants to know, what do you think a book written in 100 years might cover? Will we still be?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting question. It's one of the things you have to get used to in medicine is, everything that you're most proud of that you do, that you feel is state of the art. Even 30 or 40 years down the line, people are going to be chuckling as they say to the medical students, you're probably not going to believe this. But, back in 2020, they used to treat this by doing this, that, or the other thing. And, everything, and that's good. What we do now should, we hope, in a little while seem not as effective as it could be, too crude, too harsh, too difficult. So I think what we all hope, in pediatrics, what you all hope is that it will be more and more and more about prevention and less and less and less about treatment, with all the different things that can mean, that you'll be able to see things coming faster, sooner, and avert them, so that children can do what children are supposed to do, which is grow and develop. we know what some of the frontiers are. We know what some of the issues are, both within medicine in terms of trying to help children live better with more chronic diseases, live longer, live higher quality of life. We know what some of the issues are, certainly in neonatology, where, and at least initially, the technology to save very small, very premature babies moved faster than the technology to protect them and make sure that they, survived as intact as possible. But I think that the other area which we all think about is different kinds of safety, making the world safer for children. And I talk about this a little bit in the 20th century, car seats, automobile accidents, safety from that point of view. But obviously, if you think about gun safety, if you think about ways that you can try to make the world a less dangerous place, and you look at what is still dangerous to children, you will see all kinds of accidents, injury, and trauma.
Fascinating. Do you have any sense? Here's a very practical question for you, Perri. Do you have any sense as to when trials will begin and when children and babies can receive COVID-19 vaccines? So put on your yet.
No, I bet there's someone on this call who's got better information than me just speculating. But I did just write a piece comparing this, thinking in historical perspective, comparing this to the issue of vaccinating children against measles and rubella. That is to say, the question of how you explain to parents that you're at, when the polio vaccine trials were going on in the 50s, when Salk had developed his vaccine, parents were being asked to sign their children up for trials that they hoped would protect them against a virus that everyone was terrified of, because it came through in epidemics every summer, and it struck children, and it left empty seats in the classroom, and it left children paralyzed. Here we're talking about a virus which we know there's hesitancy among adults, and we also know that it hasn't been as severe in children. So I thought it was interesting to think about the campaigns to immunize children against measles, against rubella, where you were trying to protect children, and that's first and foremost, but you were also trying to protect a larger community, especially with the rubella vaccine, where you were immunizing children, not because rubella would be severe if the children caught it, but because the children, you didn't want them to give it to a woman who might be pregnant and end up having devastating effects on the developing fetus. So I actually remember the rubella umbrella campaign of the 1960s, in which there were TV ads directly aimed at children, telling them, get your rubella umbrella, because then you'll be a hero, you'll be protecting other people. And I thought it was interesting to look back on that at this moment, but I'm not going to tell you what the schedule is going to be.
But that's so interesting. That is providing incentives and sending positive messages. And what I keep hearing from you is community, connection, collaboration, a collective project. That is, we're in this together. And so, there has to be this sense of solidarity in moving forward. I've lost some of the questions, so maybe Audrey can jump in, but someone did ask, well, here we go. Ellen Feldman says, this is not a question, but a comment. Perri, you're a powerful speaker and I'm sure a writer. I guess she hasn't read your book yet. I'm here partly because I was a student of your father's at Barnard. He so broadened my sense of our multicultural world. He was one of the best teachers I had, and I was discussing his influence on our lives today. I can see the resemblance to your father's way of thinking and the specificity and the very large context of your discussion. And I think she's really captured the beauty of A Good Time to Be Born, which gives us these great stories, powerful stories, tragic in some cases, uplifting in others, but at the same time, the broad strokes and understanding of where we are, where we came from, and also where we're going, where we're heading.
Well, Thank you. And let me also thank you for those kind words about my father. Of course, it means a great deal to me. You know, you don't ever stop being your parents' child, but also it's wonderful as a teacher to think about the effects that teachers' words can have and the ways they can be remembered. I of course wish very much that I could have handed a copy of this book to my father and you know, included in it some stories which actually had started with him. So thank you for saying that. And they are, I mean, they are amazing stories. It's an amazing story that we've done this. It's not a completed work, it's not finished, but if you think about what it looked like at the beginning of that graph, and that's just my grandmother. That's my grandmother pregnant in Brooklyn in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. It's a very big change.
Yeah, well, that takes me to the last question that we had. Did anything surprise you while you were conducting research for the book? And I think that graph must have been, although you probably started writing knowing that, but maybe did not realize how dramatic the shift was and what it took to get from up there to down here.
It surprised me how short the term was, how quick the change was. But by the time I was done with the book, it had begun to, I'd become a little obsessed, as one does. And I'd started looking through all kinds of biographies of famous figures, famous writers, you know, famous political figures. And I would always look to see, did they lose children? And then I would always be astonished that often it would be in a footnote, or it would be in parentheses. This child and the two following children would die in the, you know, diphtheria epidemic. It would be in parentheses as if, you know, it couldn't have been a significant life event. This is not always true, but it's often true. That's why, you know, I began to feel after a while that there's this chorus of children all through recent history, longer ago history, these experiences which shaped and changed parents, which changed them forever. And often they're kind of in a parentheses.
Yeah. Extraordinary. Well, you've taken it out of the parentheses and you put it up front and center. And we are supremely grateful to you for this book. I recommend it to everybody who is listening, watching. And Audrey, I don't have a clock. I realize I don't have a clock, so I'm thinking that we may have run out of time at this point. And I see that you've closed the Q&A, so that may have been the signal for it.
Well, but, I mean, you answered all the questions. They're all gone. You answered them all, but
okay.
This was such a lovely talk, and it's weird to find a discussion of, you know, this subject so comforting, but it's so nice to hear such intelligence and care and the work you've put into this book. And it's an amazing book. I'm really excited that you were both able to join us tonight, Perri, Maria. This has been really, there's nowhere else I'd rather be on this Saturday. Oh my goodness, Friday night.
Thank you for hosting us.
Of course. Any final words?
Thank you for hosting us. Much love for the bookstore. Hope everybody supports it, not just by buying my book. I just want to thank Maria, who one of the things we didn't get to talk about, but that I did include in the book and that I've learned about from her, is to think about the ways that these issues turn up also in the books that are written for and about children, the way that these issues and the medical realities. I mean, I mentioned Little Women, but there are just a whole lot of ways that these questions, these worries, these anxieties show up in diaries and letters, but also in their stories, in their fiction, in art, in poetry, because this is the reality that they're living with. But I just also want to acknowledge, you know, Maria's example and her expertise in thinking about children and children's literature from that point of view.
Well, thank you, Perri. And as you were speaking, I thought of Charlotte's Web, which there's Papa going with that axe. When I tried course in children's literature, some of the students called it death because children's books actually have a lot of tragedy in them. And thank you for the other thought that went through my head was someone once said that paradox is the only basket large enough to hold the truth. And you have given us that truth, which is contradictory and complicated and full of great stories. And thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you both. And thank you to everyone at home tonight who's tuning in and showing up for authors, publishers, indie book selling, and our incredible staff here at Harvard Bookstore. If you're interested in buying a copy of A Good Time to Be Born, which I highly recommend, check out the link in the chat. Please remember to shop indie and shop local. Keep wearing your masks. And from all of us at Harvard Bookstore, be well. Have a great night. Take care, everybody.
Bye.